Let's turn in our Bibles real quick to Revelation. I'm going to read what we read last week again, because we are still, of the 7 churches that we are studying that represent the 7 time periods in history, and just how fascinating it is that God has given us a church history lesson in the book of the Revelation of Jesus Christ. And if we turn to, I'm in the wrong book. What's that? Okay, Revelation chapter 3, starting in verse 1. And to the angel of the church in Sardis write, "These things says he who has the 7 spirits of God and 7 stars. I know your works, that you have a name, that you are alive, but you are dead. Be watchful and strengthen the things which remain, that are ready to die. For I have not found your works perfect before God. Remember, therefore, how you have received and heard. Hold fast and repent. Therefore, if you will not watch, I will come upon you as a thief, and you will not know what hour I will come upon you. You have a few names, even in Sardis, who have not defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. He who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not blot out his name from the book of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." So we began this epoch of time talking about sort of the post-Reformation, the direction that some of the Reformed churches took and the direction that the Catholic Church took, and how everything sort of had a great beginning. Everything started out in the right direction. You know, we saw that prior to the Reformation there was rumblings. People were becoming tired of this monolithic church, and what I mean by that is that just the single. Think of a monolith as a giant single stone, like the Washington Monument is like a monolith. It's a single piece, you know, and that's what Christianity was. It was this single organization that had become top-heavy and fat and corrupt, and there were already rumblings of reform. We need to change this. We need to change this. Clearly it wasn't going to change, so what it took was a break. So we saw the break, finally, a break in the right direction, a break to, no, it's not the church that we owe our allegiance to. It's Jesus Christ and the Word of God. It was a return to the Bible having authority and not the church having authority. You know, prior to this time, if you wanted to know anything about God, it was from the church, not necessarily from the Bible. And so the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, was a turn in that direction. Unfortunately, it was barely even half a turn. It was like a quarter turn. You know, the churches that immediately broke from the Catholic Church really became what I call Catholic light, and they were really as harsh and even as vicious and even more vicious than the Catholic Church ever was in some of the movements. So we talked about that last week. So we have the one church system is over, right? And what are we left with? The basic divisions at this time, still have the Catholic Church. It's still in force, still very powerful. Went through its own counter-reformation where it began to fix some of the errors, some of the corruption, a return to less of a political entity and more of a religious entity than it had become. And it really had become a political entity. It wasn't really, had nothing to do with faith of the Bible or anything. These were all just political appointees. So it had been through some reform. And then we have the Protestants. It's really all, that's the basic division, the Catholics and the Protestants. Among the Protestants, we had the Lutherans in Germany and Scandinavia. Right, we showed this map last week. This was sort of the Lutheran world here. We had the Anglicans in southern England. We had Calvinists, which represent the Calvinists of the Swiss Confederation here, and then also the Presbyterians in Scotland. Again, you can see Roman Catholicism still remaining in the northernmost parts of what we call the UK today, and in Ireland. A mixture because of movements like the Huguenots in France, of some Protestant rumblings, and the Waldensians, and some of these Protestant movements that broke away from the Catholic Church, sort of lingering in different places in France. And then scattered divisions, just little bits and pieces of this and that. We see over here the mixed confessional area of the Anabaptists and minorities out here in what we call Eastern Europe, sort of the Hussites and the Anabaptists and different ones that were sort of on the running from the Catholics and the Protestants. So we have sort of bits and pieces here and there. Generally speaking, at this point now, as we sort of begin this new era, the religious differences are generally accepted. They are not as much persecution. Again, this is now after what we talked about the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and they went through their whole time of being persecuted. So now we're entering into a time where it's an attitude of toleration toward the non-established religions, because one of the things that didn't change is that these are still state churches. The Anglican Church was the official church of England. And more than anything, what I'm saying when I say that is the government supported it. The government subsidized the church. That's where they got their money. Some of the smaller movements and the little radical movements, they didn't get any help from the government. It was only the state-recognized church, and they were sort of, these little scattered movements were just considered, they're just little rebels. Let them be. They're not hurting anybody. Who cares? But the state established a particular religion, and this is what we're looking at here. That these churches existed because of the state supporting it. And what began to happen that we're going to get into tonight is that this evangelical commitment that sort of started was replaced with scholastic wrangling. People started talking, wrestling with issues, theological issues, because this is the first time that people have begun studying the Bible. And so they're reading their Bible, they're trying to figure out what it's saying. It's being translated into multiple languages now, and people are trying to discuss what it's talking about. And the problem is, it ended up sort of evolving into apathy. And it was not much different than the Catholic Church in that if you were born in Germany, particularly if you weren't born in one of these little Catholic regions that you see sort of speckled in here, but if you were born in Germany or Norway, Sweden, anywhere, in Scandinavia, you were Lutheran because you were born Lutheran. Not because you espoused the Lutheran faith, not because you found something about the Lutheran faith that you felt was true. People didn't have a personal relationship with God. They were what they were born into. Whatever country they were in, if you were born in England, you were Anglican, and that's the way it was. As generally as a rule, and it's what was called compelled conformity. You know, there was toleration for the little skirmishes, for the little rebellious branches that broke out, but generally speaking, this is what you were, because you were born. It was compelled conformity to whatever church or religious institution you were born into. So really not any different than what they had left. And what happens with that is the vitality of faith disappears. And all that remains is dead orthodoxy. And yep, sure.
That looks like a fixed moment in time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It took time to get to that point.
Yeah, this is what we, and then the question was, this, you know, no, via politics, really. And the question was basically, how did we get to this? This was like a fixed point in time. How and when did we get to this? This is essentially what we're looking at the end of last week's era. So about the mid 17th century, 1648, 1650, right around there is what this looks like. So now this is 30 years after the Pilgrims have left England and headed for the New World. You know, and England has already planted Jamestown in the south, and so that's going on over there. We're going to get to some of that, but just to give you an idea of what's going on. So this is about the mid 17th century that we're looking at this. This is after the smoke settles, after the 30-year war, after the Catholic Counter-Reformation, after sort of the smoke clears and settles and everybody's done arguing about this Reformation and who's right and who's wrong, and everybody just sort of says, look, let's just go our own way. Wherever we are right now, that's what we are. And so that's kind of, and it was more of a political thing, that particularly because it started in Germany, and Germany was broken up into regions with princes or dukes that presided over regions in Germany, and it was determined that whatever that duke decided, we're going to be Lutheran, or no, we're going to remain Catholic. And whatever they decided, the government decided what that was going to be. Just like the king decided we're going to be Anglican, you know. And it was more of a political institute. And remember, Scotland at this time is not part of the United Kingdom. They're really their own country at this point. And they made a decision, you know, politically to align with the Calvinists, because of John Knox and the movement that he had that basically formed the Presbyterian Church. So it was a political arrangement that was made, and that was the problem with it. And that's why it just evolved very quickly, devolved, if you want to really say, into dead orthodoxy, just like we're looking at in the Sardis church, that there was just, it had an appearance that it had life, but it was dead. And there were a few things hanging on, you know, strengthen the things that remain. There were a few hanger-oners. There was a few movements that were trying to hang on in the middle of this dead orthodoxy. And what ultimately happened with, somebody want to get that? In the midst of dead orthodoxy, people just lost interest. You know, because one of the things that we were in the middle of at this point, this is the end now we're transitioning out of the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance was a rebirth out of the Middle Ages. People were beginning to appreciate things like art and music and philosophy. People are starting to sit around and think. You know, in the Middle Ages, everybody was poor. Nobody had time to think. You went to work and you farmed 7 days a week and you worked. You know, there wasn't a whole lot of thinking. But now this is happening, this rebirth, and because of that, we enter into what's called the Enlightenment. And this is where people began to study. And it started with the Reformation taking people into the Bible, and people are like, oh, we can study the Bible, and people are studying the Bible and realizing, well, we can study other things too. And just in general, the intellectual temperature of the continent was rising, and people were beginning to contemplate things. And so as these people who are, in essence getting smarter, becoming more, I don't really want to say intelligent, because intelligence is sort of a base nature that we have, but they're becoming more educated. They're becoming more aware of things. They're looking at this dead orthodoxy and they're like, what, why do we want to be a part of this? And so we had two reactions to this condition, and one of which was rationalism, and the other one was piety. And so this is a big part of what we're going to be looking at today. So the first one is the rationalists, who initially they sort of intellectually accepted the system of orthodox dogma, right? That everybody believed, and there was sort of an intellectual acceptance of what it was. But what happened was, in response to a rise in what's called scholasticism, which basically means people were becoming more educated, people were becoming more interested in education, in academics, in learning things. We had men like, we had philosophers, we had empirical science was on the rise, we had men like Copernicus. Copernicus came up with this wild idea that the sun does not revolve around the earth, but the earth revolves around the sun. And yeah, he was called a heretic, as was Galileo, who said, wait a minute, there are things up there that are different. There are planets up there. There are other places like this, not just stars, because they're moving in and out. If you know, the word planet is a word that comes, I think it's from the Latin, that means a wanderer. Because he noticed that certain stars didn't, if you look up in the sky, if you've ever seen a time-lapse thing of the sky at night, it goes like this. Very uniform. All the stars, they draw a circular line as they revolve around the North Star, right? Well, there were some that were like, today they're over here, tomorrow they're over here, and some things they're wanderers. And that's how we determined that there was something else up there, and there was planets. So you had these scientists like Copernicus and like Galileo that were discovering things. And then finally you had a guy, Isaac Newton, who put it all together and said, wait a minute, there's a system that is working in everything. He was the first one with the sort of the theory of everything. He put it all together and said, well, wait a minute, there's an order to things. Everything is not just random. There's systems that make things happen. There's a reason why it rains. There's a reason why we have a drought. There's a reason why the seasons change. There's a reason why, one of the things that Galileo had discovered was the, I forget what it's called, terminal velocity. That if you drop an object, it will, was it Newton? Well, gravity, I don't know if he did terminal velocity, though.
He used that I'm pretty sure it was Newton.
Okay. Well, the point was that there's, if you drop something, it increases in speed at a certain rate, and it will continue to increase until it reaches a certain thing called terminal velocity, and then it will stay at that speed. And, Newton, at the very least, he saw that and said, wait a minute, that's not by accident. There is a system, and he's the one that sort of was tying everything together, and people were like, wait a minute, and he's running experiments, and they work. And then you had men like Francis Bacon, who came up with the scientific method, who said, okay, if you do an experiment, and this is stuff we learned in grade school, but this was all new to them. That if I do this thing and I have a constant, one thing I won't change, this thing I will change, and I get to the end of the experiment and I see that this happens, and every time I do the experiment, there's a predictable result in the end. Okay, so things are predictable. Right, repeatable, and that it is predictable because it is repeatable, and this was all new to them, and so this was the rise of rationalism. right? And then we had guys like Rene Descartes, who, actually it's funny because Pastor Bill quoted him in this past week's message. I think, therefore I am. The first time people were like, how do I even know? This is what Rene Descartes said. He said, how do I even know I exist? He says, I don't know if the world exists. I don't know if you exist. I'm not even sure if I exist. And then he realized, well, wait a minute. If I'm not sure if I exist, then it's something that I'm thinking about. And if I'm thinking about it, I have to exist in order to think about it. Because something that doesn't exist can't think. So I must exist, he said, and that's all I know. I know that I must exist. And he actually took it a step further, and he said, because I exist, and I know I didn't create myself, then there must be something else that exists that created me, at the very least. And that was sort of this, again, this is where people are starting to contemplate things that they had never contemplated before, and things outside of the biblical record, not necessarily looking at just theology and orthodoxy, but looking at the world and examining what's in front of them. Rene Descartes, his conclusion was that no revelation is required. Everything can be determined by reason. We can figure everything out by reason. And this was a dangerous step, because there are things that cannot be figured out. And there was a man named John Locke who responded to that, who said he upheld that there is reason and there is revelation, that there are some things that we can see and we can understand, but there are supernatural things, because the conclusion, that we'll get into a little later, is that, if we can figure everything out by ourselves, then what do we need the Bible for? If everything that is reasonable in the Bible we can figure out for ourselves, and everything that is supernatural in the Bible is really nonsense, then what do we even need the Bible for? Because if it's supernatural, then it can't be reasoned out, and so we can't even know if it's true. So we have to dismiss it out of hand. And Locke was one of the ones that said, no, there are supernatural things that are only revealed through revelation, that we will only get through, because I can't understand everything. It's not possible for me to understand everything. There are some things that I can understand because it's been revealed to me in the scriptures. And there are other things that I can figure out on my own. And this ultimately gave birth to Deism. Deism says that God has left his creation to operate under natural laws. God put all these natural laws that we're now discovering in place, and that this was called the clockmaker doctrine, that God created everything, he wound it up, and then he stepped back and said, my job is done. I don't interfere. My hand does not interject into man's world, into his universe. I have already set everything in motion. I've given them everything that they need, and I've given them the systems of nature and of logic and everything to do everything that needs to be done, and I'm done. And so it's a theistic position in that they believe that there's a God, but they just don't believe that he is intimately or even otherwise involved in human existence. Dan?
At the fall, did God not step back to a point? I mean, did he not step back and let mankind have their free will?
Well, yeah, and that's a phrase that we hear.
Miracles, and I believe in miracles.
Yeah.
I mean, unnatural events.
Yeah, and again, the question, I'm trying to repeat the questions because people are emailing me, telling me, we don't know what the questions are. Dan is asking, did not God limit himself to some degree in the garden after Adam and Eve fell? And yes, and we hear this from Pastor Bill a lot, that God limits himself. And this is God limit. It's not that God is limited, but God limits himself at the point of our free will. God will not impose himself upon us and make us robots and force us to do things. But that's not really, I wouldn't classify that even in the same vein as deism, because deism is a complete abdication. Everybody, worldwide, God is done. He's done his work, and he is complete, and he's just, now he's out of the picture. He exists, but he's just up there, and he's not really doing anything. And there is no supernatural intervention. And that was the problem, was these guys, they were getting educated, they were getting smart. They didn't see miracles happening all around them. They didn't see supernatural things. And so they said, well, if we don't see it, it was empirical data that they lived on. If we don't see it, if we don't touch it, if we don't experience it, then how do we know that it exists? So they just dismissed it and said, we're just dismissing anything supernatural. There is no supernatural intervention, so while we believe in God, since he does not supernaturally intervene, we're just going to believe that he's just sort of up there watching it all happen. And what happens is that Christ now is just a moral teacher, because for Christ to come down and die for our sins means that God has intervened. He's put his hand into our world. So now he's just a moral teacher. And that virtue and piety are the most important kinds of worship that one can give to God. That it's not our devotion, it's not our love, it's not our responding to his initiatives. It's just, can I be the best person? By being the best person that I can be, that's the greatest way that I can worship God. And so it began to put the onus and the emphasis on human behavior, and this is really the beginning of humanism. That we're what it's all about. God's essentially gone. He's left the building, and he's left us in charge of our destiny. And so we have to just be the best people that we can possibly be, and it all has to do with us, and that the Bible itself is just an ethical guidebook. It's a good book to read. It gives you some good instruction, and that when we die, there's reward and or punishment for how we've lived our life. And this dominated the upper classes in England. Some of the men that were major teachers of this: Edward Herbert, David Hume, Charles Blount. You can look up some of these guys. This was the beginning of what we call Western civilization, Western thought. Sort of the humanistic mindset. And it then moved into France, where you had guys like Voltaire, Rousseau, Denis Diderot. They called themselves free thinkers. And they started a movement of these people called philosophes, right? Not philosophers, but philosophes. And they were just these free thinkers that felt like, well, since God is gone, we don't really need him. We can figure this stuff on our own. And they met, and this is why France got into some trouble, because they really resisted the papacy. They resisted the Catholic Church. And the French didn't necessarily resist them. They kind of liked the fact that they had these men of the Enlightenment, these intelligent men. But they did not, the Pope, and we're going to find out later what happened to them, the Catholic Church resisted their spreading this doctrine. Wilfred?
Rationalists are inside the church, or they are social?
Say that again?
These rationalists are inside the church?
At this time, this is happening within the church. This is happening within, because at the time, atheism was not a thing, really. I mean, they were not, it was really not socially acceptable to be an atheist. You were considered a heathen. You were considered, not too bright to be an atheist. It just had a social stain on it. So in essence, it was coming out of the church. It was coming out of the so-called believers within the church, but people who were growing weary of just the dead orthodoxy of the church, that the church was not going anywhere, and that, this enlightenment was happening, but the church was not responding to it. And that they were beginning to question the things that they were reading in the Bible, because they didn't believe in supernaturalism. They didn't believe in the supernatural. Eventually this movement moved to the colonies, and we had men like Franklin, Jefferson, Ethan Allen, Thomas Paine, and some of these men, and deism is not, we can't put deism in a box and say this is what it is and this is all it is. Deism exists within a spectrum. Like a man like Thomas Paine was a true deist. He was, and he may have even been as close to being an atheist as it comes. And he was the voice of the revolution, but he was a humanist. For sure, he was a humanist. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, they were humanists, they were deists, but I wouldn't call them strict deists. I mean, Benjamin Franklin prayed, and Benjamin Franklin encouraged prayer. Now, it could have been that he just, and he made a quote similar to this, that look, even if there isn't a God, this is good. This is good for us, that we do this because it's good for our virtue. But he did encourage people to pray, and it seems not logical for somebody who doesn't believe that God intervenes to encourage people to pray. What are you asking for from a God who won't intervene? So there's a spectrum of this. And certainly when they say, well, all the founding fathers were just deists, atheists and deists, they definitely were not atheists. Like I said, the closest one to an atheist was probably Thomas Paine. Some of them considered themselves deists. The vast majority of them were devout Christians, and many, many of them were ordained ministers. So,
Thomas Paine was born in America.
well, most of these guys weren't. Most of these guys weren't born in America. A lot of our founding fathers weren't born in America. So the results of deism, it sort of killed itself, because the de-emphasis on sin and overemphasis on human goodness. So my sin is not a violation of God's law. It's just that I'm not perfect yet. I haven't fixed everything yet.
Wasn't Jefferson the one that had his own Bible basically by blotting out things that he didn't agree with?
Yeah, but he also, when he was president, he said that the Bible should be the textbook in every school in America.
But he was obviously he was Christian influenced.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and if you asked him, he would probably say he's a Christian, but very intellectual, and was not. I wouldn't say that he was a devout adherent to the Bible, but yet, man of great contradiction too. Very humanistic in his mindset, but then also had the Bible printed as a textbook. Jim?
Rick, Jefferson spoke out on both sides of his mouth a lot about Christianity, but there's been a whole lot of what he said that sounds like he could be given it from Calvary Chapel pulpit. I mean, and that stuff has not been, we don't know about that because nobody ever quotes that stuff. He's been used on the other side for years.
Oh, yeah.
I think maybe later in his life he may have realized that when he was saying the good stuff, he was saying what was true. I don't know if he ever got saved, but
Yeah.
he should not be an icon of
No, none of the founding fathers should be being used in the way that they're being used. Like, oh, they were just a bunch of atheists and they didn't believe in God. They all believed in God. Again, at this time, it would have been a social stain on you to call yourself an atheist. It was.
Unsure of who God was.
Was that?
Could you say they were just unsure of who God was?
Well, they were unsure of they were unsure of what he was. You know what I mean? They just didn't know. They were trying to contemplate. These were smart guys. I mean, these guys all spoke multiple languages. They read. They were the most well-read people ever. I mean, they read libraries of books, you know. So, so the de-emphasis on sin, overemphasis on human goodness and perfectibility, the dignity of man, religious tolerance. So, you know, there was a part of them that said, look, let everybody believe what they want to believe, you know, because, you know, we're believing this. People should be allowed to believe whatever they want to believe. But the problem is it collapsed under its own over-optimism, because if man is so good, then why is there evil in the world? Why is there so much evil? Why are there so many bad things? If man is essentially good, then things should essentially be getting better, but they weren't. So the whole concept of it sort of died out as a movement. So that was rationalism. The second reaction to the dead orthodoxy of this new Reformed church, if you will, is the pietists. Okay, essentially ascribed to a man named Philip Jacob Spener. He was a Lutheran pastor. He looked at what was going on. He looked at the dead orthodoxy. He looked at the rationalistic reaction and said, this isn't good either. We need to deepen our spiritual lives, not our intellectual lives. We need, you know, and he encouraged lay people to meet together in groups. Because remember, at this time, if you weren't an ordained minister, you didn't go out and do religious things. You didn't go out and do spiritual things. That was for them to do. And he's saying, you know, basically, let's have home fellowships. Let's get together in small groups and talk about the Bible and talk about the Lord. And, you know, they were originally called pietists as a derogatory term. And his, you know, his vocabulary was that, you know, he had what was called pious wishes. He wanted people to be more godly. When I say pious, it means godly. His aim was that we all need to be more godly. It's not that we need to be more educated. It's not that we need to be more intelligent, more rational, more reasonable. We need to be more godly. And there were 6 proposals that he set forth for piety. To study God's word, to enhance our personal devotion, to encourage all Christians to exercise their own priesthood. Remember the end of sacerdotalism, the end of needing a holy man or cleric to handle my relationship with God. To cultivate brotherly love, not just knowledge. And he had no problem with rationalism. He had no problem with educating oneself, but he said this needs to go hand in hand with godliness. And he said, you know, religious controversy, if we want to argue about theology and orthodoxy, let's do it to win people, not just to see who's right, not just for knowledge, but to win hearts. To train ministers, here's a novel idea, to train ministers in piety, not just scholarship. That these men who are running the church should be godly men, not just educated men. That there needs to be a lifestyle that is commensurate, that matches with the fact that they're teaching the Bible. You know, and again, this is a new concept. I know for us, we're like, well, of course. For them, it wasn't. You know, remember, we're coming out of a time when the priests and the ministers were political appointees, and there's still that to some degree, because each of these religions, each of these particular Protestant faiths have a state religion. So which means there is a cabinet member in that government that is in charge of the church. And he has most likely been appointed as a political position, not because he was a spiritual guy. And that stuff trickles down. And so, you know, Spener is saying, look, let's stop this. These men should be they should be godly, not just smart. And that sermons were for the purpose of Christian edification, not just, you know, a lecture in orthodoxy or theology or some, you know, personal agenda to beat people into submission and acting right, but that it should be for the purpose of Christian edification. And so this began to spread through Lutheranism, and it started revitalizing the church. And we saw a number of men sort of rising up to this. August Hermann Frank was one, a professor at the University of Halle. He reformed his school into a scholastic center, but it was a pious school. It was a school for piety, so that people were being trained not just in what the Bible said, they were being trained in what godly living was all about. And there's another man, and it becomes very important to where we're going to be going soon, a man named Count Nicholas von Zinsendorf. It's a great name, isn't it? Zinsendorf. Born to, his parents were pietists, believed in godly living, in addition to being well educated, and educated again at Halle in Germany. In 1722, what happened was he had was a wealthy man and had a compound, had a giant estate. And remember John Huss, the man they burned at the stake prior to the Reformation? There were still followers, the Hussites, coming out of Bohemia, or modern-day Czech Republic, that were heading up into Germany, just still moving their way up. We see, here's my little, if we go back to this picture, the Hussites in and around here in Bohemia, moving their way through, trying to find a place where they won't be harassed, where they can be accepted. And finally, this group landed on Count von Zinzendorf's home, and he welcomed them in and said, start your society here, start your community here. I have a large estate, you can live here, you can make houses, you can build on my estate, live here and practice your faith. And it grew to a point where he then became their leader. He was converted to their belief and then became their leader. And the emphasis and why this is important, the emphasis on these, and they were called now Moravians because they had come through Moravia. They had been living in Moravia for a while, and now they settled in Germany with Zinsendorf. And these Moravians, the emphasis that they had in their particular society was on missions. And they began, from Zinzendorf's estate, began sending people out all across the world to give the gospel. And again, this was not happening. People were not converted to Christianity. People were born into a faith. Bearing in mind that the majority of the world is Christian. So where are you sending your people to? Well, he's sending the people to various parts within Europe to tell them about true faith. And he's also sending them outside of Europe. And one of the places that he sent them was to the Americas. And they boarded a ship and they traveled to Georgia, where they started and they were called the United Brethren, was another name that they went by. And they settled in Georgia, and in particular in North Carolina. And one of the fellow passengers that was on that ship with them when they went to Georgia was a man named John Wesley. And we're going to talk about him in just a minute. But before we get to John Wesley, we're going to back up a little bit because I want to look at France. Because France was a little bit of a unique thing after the Reformation, because they were not part of the Reformation. Okay, they remained Catholic. And so the religious system in France got very complicated. They persecuted the Huguenots, who were Protestants. They were breaking away from the Catholic Church. But they wanted independence from the papal authority. They were not willing to accept the Pope's supreme authority over their lives. They were more royalists. they accepted that the Pope was the head of the church, but they said the king should choose the French clergy because he is our king. The Pope is not our king. He is our sovereign. He is our ruler. And, at the time, Louis XIV was a supporter of the Pope, but only because it gave him more power. A lot of political maneuvering going on. And so there was a lot of, you had the Royalists, and then you had the Catholics. And in particular, you had the Jesuits in France. Remember, the Jesuits came out of Portugal, Spain, and France. Strong presence. The Jesuits were the Delta force for the Pope. And they were very strong in France. And so you had the Loyalists that supported the king, and then you had the Jesuits who wanted to steer people back to the Pope. A lot of tension, and then to top it all off was a man named Cornelius Jansen, who was he was not a Protestant, he was an anti-Protestant. I am a Catholic. But he looked at the Jesuits in particular, and he looked at the church and said, there's a problem with your morals. The Jesuits followed a philosophy called probabilism that said, I can commit a sin so long as there's a good reason for it. I can assassinate a person so long as they're a heretic. I can lie. It's okay for me to lie so long as I'm trying to catch somebody in heresy. It was sort of this relative mindset of I can do wrong things so long as it's for the right reason. And Jansen was like, that's wrong. Wrong is wrong, no matter who does it, and no matter when you do it, and for whatever reason. And so he fought against the papal supremacy. He challenged the Jesuits in their moral, condition. Eventually, though, they were driven, the Jansenites, the Jansenists, who followed him, he started a movement. And again, bearing in mind, he was not anti-Catholic. He was anti-Protestant. He affirmed the Catholic Church, but he wanted to see reforms in piety, in godliness within the clergy, at the very least within the clergy. And but was met with resistance by both the Loyalists and the Jesuits, and they were driven out of France. And the French church became identified with intolerance and persecution. They had persecuted the Huguenots, now they're persecuting the Jansenists. And at the same time, all this rationalism and the Deists are working their way from England into France. And they're standing up and they're saying, they're challenging the corruption of the French church with their rationalism. And two of them in particular, Denis Diderot, assembled a group of rationalists and wrote an encyclopedia and created a society that they called Philosophes, and that's what I was talking about earlier. They advocated democracy and they attacked the church. They felt like the church should not be have that level of authority, that we should have some say in what goes on in the church, and the Pope shouldn't tell us what to do. And the most famous of these men was a man named Voltaire, who declared war on the Jesuits, and eventually did turn atheists and violent and bitter. And he led the Philosophes to denouncing the church, which eventually laid the groundwork for the French Revolution, which was why the French Revolution was, our revolution was based on biblical principles and on the frustration, number one, that we were an independent nation already in a sense. We were separate geographically and had our own governments and things going on here, and we're not being treated with the same rights as those in England. The French Revolution was just a bloody, godless revolution. And part of it was this violent attitude against authority that was built up by Voltaire. One of the interesting things that is said of Voltaire, that he determined he was going to wipe the Bible off the face of the earth. Ironically, after he died, his home was turned into a printing company for Bibles. God, irony is not lost on God. And eventually, the Jesuits got a bad name because of their persecution, because of their intoleration. They fell on hard times, bad press. They were driven from France, Portugal, and Spain. Eventually, the Catholic Church did disavow them for a long time. And the Jesuits were considered, the Pope kind of cut them loose and just said, we don't recognize you anymore. Eventually, they welcomed them back in later on. And that's why they, in a much more pacifistic condition, the Jesuits are not starting wars and killing people the way they were back then. Yeah. Oh yeah. That is true. Yeah, he was basically a Jesuit. Yeah, it became more of sort of a like the Dominicans and the Franciscans, and it was sort of a movement. That's. Yeah, the Jesuit schools, very, very strict Jesuit schools, but they're not they're not the Delta Force or the hitmen for the Pope anymore, at least that we know of. So getting back to, again, at this point, deism is dominating England. We talked about Edward Herbert, the founder. He went into with this attitude: there is a God. He ought to be worshipped. John Wesley. There is a God. He ought to be worshipped. Virtue is how we worship him. And there is another life. And that virtue is exalted over theology. So it doesn't matter what you believe so long as you're a good person. And this is the direction they're sort of taking Christianity. They consider themselves Christians, but emphasize reason and rationalism. And as it always happens, the next generation, because this first generation were trying to hang on to theism and the belief in God. Well, the second generation challenged biblical authority. Because this is the sort of the evolution that these things take. Meanwhile, the Anglican Church is becoming very, very formal, rational. It's been affected by the deists and the rationalists, and sterile. The Puritans have long since left. Most of the Puritans are now in America, and they're settling into New England, and they've had it with the Anglican Church, and they still consider it. I mean, the Puritans, we sort of see them as breaking from the Anglican Church, but they saw themselves as the true Anglican Church. They said, we are the pure Anglican Church. We are the Anglican Church. We're what's left of it. What's over there is the aberration that happened to the church. We're the pure Anglican Church. So now we have John Wesley popping on the scene here. 1703 to 1791. Born in a parsonage. His father and his grandfather were Anglican preachers. He was educated at Oxford, assisted his father in ministry, was given a fellowship at Oxford, was ordained a minister in the Anglican Church, and then was encouraged to take a trip to America. There was a ship that was leaving for Georgia, and it was said to him that it would be good for him to convert the savages, to go and the Indians, the Native Americans that were there, to go preach the gospel to them. The interesting thing is that I think even John Wesley would say that at this point, he wasn't even really saved. He hadn't really even had a conversion to Jesus Christ. He was just, again, born into the church, was raised in a minister's family, was raised to be a minister, never had an actual experience with Jesus Christ. On this trip, he was with the Moravians, and he got to know these Moravian missionaries that were heading over to Georgia, heading over to America to do the same thing, to be a missionary organization. While they were on their way, they hit a very bad storm, and he thought that he was going to die. He thought the ship was going to sink. And he noticed these Moravians were not frightened. They were just going on. They were singing. They were blissful. They were joyful. They had no fear. And he asked them why. And they said, well, because the Lord Jesus Christ lives within us. We've been, and the phrase that they used was, because we've been born again. And he didn't know what that meant. He didn't know what it meant to be born again. He didn't know what it meant to be converted, to put his faith in Jesus Christ as a personal Savior. And he couldn't believe that they were so sure of their salvation, of their destiny, that they weren't fearful of the storm. And it convicted him that he was that fearful of the storm because he didn't know what would happen to him if he died. He didn't know if he was going to be a good enough person, if his piety and his godliness, his personal, endeavors, his personal good works was going to be enough to get him into heaven. He had a horrible time in Georgia. He found that the Native Americans were much more brutal and uncooperative than he expected. And he got caught up in a controversy and a scandal. There was a woman who he had proposed to and then broke off the proposal. And then when she ended up being proposed to, being engaged to another man, he denied her communion, shaming her in the community, and there was a whole big scandal, and he was basically driven, you know what, you better go, just go, because he was just making a bigger mess of things, and went back to England. And when he went back to England, he sort of picked up where he had left off with his brother, Charles Wesley, who was known for writing, I think, over 5,000 songs. He found that his brother had sort of begun a little movement where he was speaking to him, because Charles was also with him, and I think had gone back to England before him. And Charles was also changed by the experience with the Moravians. And Charles had gone back to England, and he was beginning to reach out to people about this new way of looking at faith being a personal experience with Jesus Christ and not just a religion that we were born into. And he first went to the churches, and this thing was called the Holy Club, or the Bible Moths, the Bible Bigots they were called, and the Bible Study Methodists, because one of the things that John Wesley was very gifted in was administration, even in his own life. He took an inventory of the things in his life that needed to be fixed, and he determined methods that he would take in his life in order to fix the things that were wrong with him. Just a very methodical man. And that's why the movement that he started ended up being called the Methodists. But he was being rejected by the Anglican Church. They didn't want anything to do with him. So the church closed their doors to him. They wouldn't let him speak. He started sort of being an itinerant speaker, speaking in different Anglican churches. Eventually they just said, no, we're not letting you come in anymore. You're a little too animated, because back then the way that they did a message is they just stood there and they just read, and it was dead, it was boring, it was a lecture, and there was no life and there was no Holy Spirit. And John Wesley was bringing in the life and the Holy Spirit, and they didn't want any part of it, and so they told him he was not welcome in any Anglican churches. And he hooked up with George Whitefield, and the two of them started working. And George Whitefield was a character. George Whitefield he basically was an actor, not as a profession, but just in his personality. When he did a sermon, he had props. He was animated. He would sing. He would put on a play. He was a ball of fire. And one of the things that he said is that at the time he and Charles were just finding poor people out in the field and saying, look, anybody want to hear a message? Let's come together. And he gathered all these poor people that were not allowed in the Anglican church because they were sinners. They were not godly people. And so they were not allowed in the Anglican church. So John Wesley said, okay, I'll preach to them. And they gathered around, and he started a movement. And before long, he was preaching to 25 and 30,000 people at a time in these fields. People were coming out to hear him. And revival broke out in England. And they say you cannot, during this period of time, you cannot read anything, not even just church history. If you read anything historical about England during this time period, it will include John Wesley, because he transformed England, and revival broke out even within the Anglican church, because then you had men like John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace, and who was the pastor of William Wilberforce. And if you've never seen, how many here have seen that movie Amazing Grace? If you haven't seen it, find it. I can't. I used to have it, and I lent it to somebody, never got it back, and I can't find it anywhere. What was that?
John Newton was the captain of a slaving ship.
Yeah, exactly. But he was part of this movement, this method, and the thing is, this Methodist movement, John Wesley never said, I am not in the Anglican church. He's always considered himself an Anglican. But he was a sect within the Anglican church, is the way he saw his movement. And people within the Anglican church were flocking to him, men like John Newton and William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce is the man who ended slavery in England, not because of some ethical or civic duty. It was because God told him it was an aberration. God told him it was an abomination. And he was convicted in his heart that it was his job to end slavery in England. And if you can get your hands on that movie, it's called Amazing Grace. And it's a phenomenal story about the story of William Wilberforce. And these are some of the men. This is some of the things that happened because of the work of John Wesley, the revival that he started. And it didn't just end there. And some people say that he prevented a French Revolution in England, that England was rife for a revolution, but this revival prevented it. And again, he remained in the Anglican Church until his death. Followers afterward formed the Methodist Church in England, and he had sent men along with George Whitefield to America to begin to evangelize. Because bear in mind, at this point, America is a mission field. America has not sent any missionaries. They're just, at this point, they're colonies. We're not even a country yet. These are colonies mixed with mostly English citizens and Native Americans. And he sent men to the colonies to begin evangelizing the colonies. And we're going to, next week when we get into some things, we're going to see how the Methodist Church became the largest church in America. Just spread like wildfire across America. But North American Christianity started because of Christopher Columbus, right? Christopher Columbus, 1492, right? Landed in El Salvador, thereabouts. And shortly after that, Spain and Portugal began sending both settlers as well as soldiers and priests to, convert and or conquer anybody who is going to stand in their way of settling these areas. And that's why we see really from Mexico all the way down through South America is predominantly Hispanic, Spanish-speaking, because they pretty much owned that. They were the first one out of the gate, and they never looked back. And most of southern United States, Florida, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. That was all part of Mexico. That was all part of the Spanish. One of the reasons that Florida, which was not one of the American colonies, was not one of the original colonies, Florida was added later, has the oldest city in America, St. Augustine, which was part of this settlement when the first Spanish settlers came over to this area. And they brought their missionaries. France got in on the game and went to Canada. And then they kind of did this interesting route where they went to Canada and then went down the Mississippi, right? We know about the Louisiana Purchase, that whole western territory down into Louisiana. And the interesting, this is one of those little facts that some people may not know, is that really the only reason that they went down, the only reason that Louisiana existed and the Louisiana territory, that France had it, was to feed Haiti. Haiti was their cash cow. Haiti, the cane fields in Haiti was the cash cow for the French. And when the Haitians eventually threw the French out of Haiti, they didn't need Louisiana anymore. They had no reason to have Louisiana. They kept Canada, but they didn't need all that in Louisiana and the whole Louisiana territory. So that's why they sold it to Thomas Jefferson, because they really didn't even need it anymore. But so the French settled in Canada and down into Louisiana, and of course the English planted colonies. Now, the French brought their Catholicism into Canada. The Spanish brought their Catholicism down into South America, Central America. When England sent settlers, however, it was a much more mixed bag. It was much more diverse in the churches that were being settled. In New England, the Puritans, which were basically Congregationalists, right? Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire. There was no Vermont, there was no Maine at that time. Rhode Island is an exception. Rhode Island is a really cool exception because early on, one of the things that happened was the Puritans were Puritans. And sometimes when you're a purist, nobody's pure enough. And there was a small group of Puritans who called themselves Baptists. And they basically believed everything that the Puritans believed except for infant baptism. They believed that you should be baptized as an adult, that it's the answer of a good conscience, like Peter says. And the Puritans considered them heretics and began persecuting them and driving them out through Massachusetts from town to town. The Puritans were driving them out until one of their own, Roger Williams, stood up and said, we left England because of people like you. This is not what we're supposed to be doing here. If we don't, if we're not allowing people to practice their faith in their way, then why do we even leave England? And so what he did is he went a little east and a little south and founded an area called Providence Plantation. And he declared, in this spot, believe what you want. And it was not just Christian. You can be, a Baptist, you can be a Puritan, you can be a Presbyterian, you can be a Catholic, you can be a Jew. He says, in this place is freedom of religion. Similar thing happened in Pennsylvania. William Penn was given a charter by the king to start his own. He had somehow essentially worked up a debt, not that he owed money, but that the king owed him money. The English kingdom owed William Penn money, and so the king said, we're going to pay you back in land. You can have this whole plot of land. At the time, this is what it was. And he said, it's yours to settle, and that's why it's called Pennsylvania. This is William Penn. And he was a Quaker, but he said, this is going to be a place where people can practice whatever they want. We are not going to have an established religion. And by that, again, we're saying that the church is not going to be supported by the government. That was not the case in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Connecticut. The Congregational church was supported by the government, by the governors. We're seeing the same thing sort of happening on a smaller scale from state to state. In New York, originally Dutch Reformed. How many here from New York? What's the original name of New York? Dick? No? No idea? Anybody know what the original name of New York was? New Amsterdam, because it was settled by the Dutch. But the English didn't like that the Dutch were muscling in on their territory, and they told them, you got to go, you got to get out. And so when they took it over, they changed the name to New York instead of New Amsterdam, because it was founded by the Duke of York, or at least in his name it was founded in the Duke of York. And then it was changed over more to Anglican and Presbyterian, but that really actually didn't even happen until after the Revolution. But the Dutch Reformed Church was being supported by the government in New York up until that time. Delaware was sort of a mixed bag. It was free in the sense, it wasn't free in the sense that it was declared free like Roger Williams or William Penn did. It was just, they just never really established a religion there. They just never really went through the point of supporting any particular religious group. Maryland was founded by Catholics. Lord Calvert settled Maryland. They were the remaining, remember, there was Mary and Elizabeth. Mary returned back to the Catholic Church, and then, and that whole thing happened. Well, there was still a small group of a remnant of people that were faithful in England to the Catholic Church, and they were being persecuted. Now the Catholic Church is being persecuted for not being Protestant and for being loyal to their Queen Mary. And they were given, mercifully, they were just told, go to America, start your own area. And they settled in an area and called it Maryland, after Queen Mary. And so it was founded as Catholic. Eventually, and it was Catholic, the government supported the Catholic Church there, as well as what they received from the Pope. But at that point, they were not getting a lot of help from Rome, because they were just a colony. But they were not allowing anybody to rise to be voted as governor unless they were a Catholic. And eventually they passed something that was called the Edict of Toleration that said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. And eventually it was changed over to Anglican. They elected an Anglican governor, and then it became an Anglican government and an Anglican church that was supported by the Anglican government. But again, we still have this establishment, and that's an important word, because that's the word that's used in the Constitution. Establishment, an established church. From there on down, it's pretty much the Anglican Church. And that becomes a real issue. Methodism came later in New York. This was after the Revolution. The Methodists really took hold in New York, and the Presbyterians took hold in New York. And we'll see next week sort of the spread of things. But this was a new order. There was no, this is what became voluntarism. They were saying that conversion was necessary for church membership. It used to be, well, you were born there, so you're part of that church. No, if you want to be a part of this church, and this was a different thing in America now, if you want to be a part of this church, even the Congregational church, you want to be a part of this Congregational church, you can't just be born into it. You need to be able to show that you were converted, that you put your faith in Jesus Christ. And some of these, like I said, in some of these places, there was no established churches, and churches had to make it on their own. They had to pay their bills by just passing the plate and raising money, right? There was no government subsidizing their existence. And, one of the things that happened was Jonathan Edwards, who was a Congregationalist pastor in Massachusetts, right about there, Northampton. I actually been there. Used to go there a lot. We used to go evangelizing in Northampton all the time. Crazy. How many know about like Austin, Texas? Austin, Texas is kind of it's a little bit of a nut place, right? Northampton is the same thing on a very much smaller scale right now. I mean, it's everything you can imagine in life. The bearded lady, literally the bearded lady. We had this woman who was didn't know that she was a woman until we went up and talked to her. And we used to have what was called I Hate America corner, where it was this one corner where there was always a line of people, 120 people or so, with signs about how they hated America. And it's just but at this time, it was kind of the same. There was sin, there was carousing, there were people that were living the way they wanted to live, and then they showed up in church and they wanted to receive communion, and Jonathan Edwards said, no. Show me that you've been converted, and then you could become a member of this church, and then you can receive communion. And they had never, we were born here. Well, I was born in this church. He's like, I don't care where you were born. You need to show that you have put your faith in Jesus Christ, and then you can become a member of this church, and then you can receive communion. And it sparked a great controversy. And he preached a message called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he, to this day, it's remembered as a fire and brimstone. The picture is that Jonathan Edwards was screaming and yelling and putting on a whole big show and scaring people. He read it from a manuscript in a monotone voice. And one of the pictures that he gave in the message was that God holds us over hell like someone holds a spider over a candle. What are you waiting for? It's, the one movement and you're done and you're in hell. And he put the fear of God in them about the life that they were living. And it sparked a revival. That little did he know, there had already been sort of sparks of revival in New Jersey and in the South. A man named Samuel Davies in the South. George Whitefield had begun something in Boston. And what he did was, what George Whitefield realized, there was something going on already in New Jersey. And Samuel Davies was down in the South, and there was a revival going on. George Whitefield sort of put them all together. And what broke out was called the Great Awakening. And there were people coming to the Lord, people coming to Christ, true salvation, true conversion to Christ in the millions. And this really paved the way for the revolution. And there was even during the revolution, there was even a regiment called the Black Regiment, because they were all pastors, they were all ministers, and they fought. This idea, one of the things that happened in the Great Awakening was this idea of independence, that we can choose to believe, that we can be a part of a church that we want to be a part of a church of, that we can choose to believe in this and not believe in that, and that there was true freedom of choice in this new set of colonies. And that was that was sort of the poison pill, if you will, that got people thinking, well, wait a minute. If we can choose that, then we can choose our own independence in government as well. And that sparked the revolution. Now, the revolution sort of brought its own problems, just as we close things out. The first being all these Anglican churches. Becomes, when you fight a war against a people and you throw them out of your country, it's a little tricky to now go to their church, because all those churches were Anglican churches. And by that I mean they were basically owned, operated, supported by the Anglican Church in England. And all these Anglican churches had to make a decision what they were going to do. And they're in Boston, part of the Freedom Trail you can walk through, they have what they call the royal churches. And that's what they were. They were the Anglican churches. And it wasn't that big in Boston, because the congregational was larger in Boston at the time. But a lot of these churches shut down. What a lot of churches ended up doing was they said, well, we're going to continue what we've been doing, but we are just going to not be connected with the Anglican Church anymore. And what they did is they took their form of government, which was an episcopal form of government. They had bishops. They had a hierarchy of government. Each, church had a pastor or a priest, and then over him was a bishop who would be over several churches, and then other bishops over those bishops, and it was a hierarchy, and that was called an episcopal or episkopos, which is an overseer in the Greek New Testament, and they became the Episcopal Church. And it was just recently, does anybody know how many years? It wasn't that long ago. It was just a few years ago that the Episcopal Church actually reunited with the Anglican Church. It was I think it was less than 10, 15 years ago that the Episcopal Church officially had a reunification with the Anglican Church in England. I think they still have their own government, but they look at the Archbishop of Canterbury as the head of their church. Again, we saw what was happening with the Maryland Catholics. That switched over to Anglican later. But what also was happening was many of the churches were switching over and saying no church affiliation, no church establishment. James Madison, when he was in the legislature, in the Virginia legislature, Virginia was deciding, what are we going to do? We're Anglican. Are we going to say that now the Episcopal Church is our official church? And they said, no, we should break free. And at one point they said, let's just say that Christianity is the official church of Virginia. And James Madison actually got up and said, no religious affiliation with the government, no connection. And this is before he wrote the First Amendment. He got up and said, no religious affiliation with the government. There should be no, because if you say, well, Christianity is our state religion, whose Christianity? Yours? Mine? Theirs? What, you may not think that I'm a Christian. You may not think my Christianity is a form of Christianity. He said, we're not going to have that. We will have no religious affiliation with any government. Then there'll be no support from the government. Each church will have to support itself, and there will be a division between the government and the church. And the southern states were the first one to do this, and actually the last state, my home state, Massachusetts, 1833. Took them nearly 60 years to get on the bandwagon and finally declare that there will be no official church state. And there are, growing up, congregational churches were everywhere in Massachusetts. I grew up in a Catholic church. A lot of the northeastern states had a strong Catholic influence just because of all the immigrants from Italy and Ireland in the turn of the 20th century, early 20th century. So that's why there's a lot of Catholicism up there as well. But that sort of began the process, and this is forgive the term, but in one sense, a new world order. It was a new order of doing things. That the church is going to be over here, The government is going to be over here, and the two need to stay out of each other's hair. Now, by that, I'm not saying that as Christians we shouldn't be politically active and that we can't take our faith, which is our belief system, and use it in our decision-making process in the government. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that, number one, the First Amendment doesn't say that the church can't do this. The First Amendment says Congress shall pass no law respecting an establishment of religion. Congress cannot recognize any particular religion and say, this is our official religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The church is free to be part of the political process. There's nothing wrong with the church being part of the political process. But one thing I don't want, when I vote for president, this is my personal thing, I'm voting for president, I'm not voting for pastor. I don't want a theocracy. Theocracies don't work. We've seen that. We've just been through 1,000, 2,000 years almost of how failed a theocracy works. That when government gets their hands on the church, or the church gets their hands in the government, and by that I mean an established relationship. I don't want there to be a cabinet post for religion, the secretary of religion. I don't want a secretary of religion. Has no place in the cabinet. Now that's not to say that they can't pray before a meeting. And, as a believer, I think they should. I don't think most of them in there are actually praying, but I don't think there's anything wrong with it. And they can choose not to do it, and that's their choice. I don't think it's wrong to do it, but it's their choice. It's not, we can't get the two intermingled. And to me, that's the most important thing that was established in America, was untangling that mess that essentially Constantine made. Going back to the days when Constantine, somewhat unintentionally combined the two and thought this would be a good thing if the church can get support from the government and the government can use the church as a launching point for things. And, that took thousands of years to untangle. And it's a very important part of, the American experience that we have. And it's still, to this day, there are still, you can go, the Archbishop of Canterbury is a political appointment, and the Queen of England is considered the head of the church. She's considered the head of the Anglican Church. It's still in existence today. You can go to Germany, and there are Lutheran delegates within the government of the German, whatever they call it, their parliament. That things are still tied in together, and the American experiment, the big part of that was to untangle that mess. And so, I think and when we get into next week, we're going to see the revival. This is sort of the beginning of, strengthening the things that remain that we saw in the Sardis church, all that dead orthodoxy, all the the rationalism and the intellectualism that was poisoning faith, and the revival that came out of it, primarily by John Wesley, who sparked it, begins what we'll read next week, which is the Church of Philadelphia, the faithful church. And we're going to see what happens, particularly with influences from England and from that revival that broke out in England and that revival that broke out in the United States, continues on for about 100 years of missions and just Christianity being spread throughout the world because of these revivals that took place. So, questions? Comments? Okay, so next week, next chapter is, what is it called? The age of progress. We're finally getting somewhere. Progress, the age of progress. So read that section, and let's pray.